Hello everybody, here I am. I'm having a picnic with my cat. Yes, and my cat and I are really very keen on the latest Year 10 cat because we've got some ideas, haven't we, Puss? Yes, we have. Okay, it's really very interesting. So let's go through and see what we've got. The first set of questions are essentially preliminary ones about who created each text. Doe wrote the autobiography called Happiest Refugee, whereas the three-part television series called Once Upon a Time in Cabramatta was created by the series producer Bernadine Lim and was written also by Jacob Hickey. Okay, so they're the first set of preliminary questions, nice and easy. Pussy's beginning to purr already. Okay, the next part is the Venn diagram. We love Venn diagrams in English, and this is a chance to look at where one book, Happiest Refugee, has some unique characteristics, where the movie, Once Upon a Time, has some unique characteristics, and then where both of them have a few things in common. Now, the way I see it, Happiest Refugee is essentially unique in that Doe is a hard-working student, does lots of part-time jobs, gives things a good go, a lot of effort, gets rewarded. I would say it's unique in that it's humorous and warm as well. And I also think that in the case of Happiest Refugee, it's very much a story about Arne. Whereas what the two stories have in common, what Happiest Refugee and Once Upon a Time both have in common, is that they centre around Vietnamese language, Vietnamese culture, and the Vietnamese community. A strong sense of family, a strong sense of community is evident in both. Also, I would suggest that both stories have the Sydney migrant experience as something they've got in common. What it's like to be a Vietnamese migrant in Sydney. And I think the in Sydney part matters because Sydney itself has certain characteristics which we'll get to a little bit later. Lastly, Once Upon a Time in Cabramatta definitely has its unique characteristics. Tony and Lamb are drug dealers and users. Tony and Lamb are rugged, hard-scrabble characters as they tell their stories. They are unlucky. They are desperate. I think what also is unique to Once Upon a Time is that Once Upon a Time is wider in its scope. It's a wider story. There's police, there's a sociologist commenting on the experience of the broader community. Whereas Happiest Refugee, I feel, is quite narrow. It's Doe's story. It's Doe's immediate family. But even then, his immediate family, as their experiences touch on Doe, it's narrow in scope. Whereas Once Upon a Time is quite broad in scope. Alright, the last part is more detailed comparison. Okay? Similarities and differences. My points of similarity will definitely revolve around racism, Ando experiences racism, such as at the RSL club when he's doing his gig, such as from people in the street when he's a kid, such as from his teachers who ought to have known better at the primary school, and even the teachers at St Aloysius. So racism is a theme. Likewise, racism is a recurring theme in terms of what the sociologist Andrew Jakovich says in Once Upon a Time. There's racism as the police discuss it in Once Upon a Time, and there's definitely racism that impacts on Tony and Song's experiences in Once Upon a Time. I would also suggest that money is something that is similar across the two stories. Money, or more precisely the lack of it, and what the lack of money forces people to do. The language barrier. They are Vietnamese people, and language is a struggle as they're growing up. Also, absent parents. And that's, in a sense, a flow-on effect of the money. Absent parents, in Arne's case, because they are having to work so much, stitching the garments, and also Arne's father later on leaving. Okay, whereas differences between the two revolve a number of factors that occur to me. The heavy influence of the drug culture in Cabramatta in the 80s and into the 90s pervades Once Upon a Time in a way that it's only marginal in Happiest Refugee. Once Upon a Time is strong on the drug haunts, the mall in Cabramatta, the railway station in Cabramatta, the drug culture, the whistling, the carrying on, the way that drugs then open you up to become a dealer and you can get money and solve the money problem. Whereas in Happiest Refugee, drugs are only tangential to the story. Arne witnesses someone in a supported accommodation where he's doing volunteer work at St Aloysius because they've got good moral values, and witnesses someone who vomits and is physically ill and is physically repellent, so Arne's put off the drugs. I would suggest, on the other hand, school is a difference. Schooling is a difference. Education has an emphasis right from when they start at primary school, then the struggle to get Arne and Qua to go to St Aloysius, born for great things. That's an idea that appeals to Arne's parents. The moral values certainly appeals to Arne's mother. The importance of education as accessing the new culture, to making your way in the new culture, and also from the value of education making you a better person. And that recurs time and time again in Arne Do's story, whereas for Son and for Tony, education is something that you put up with. It gets in the way. It causes problems. It causes arguments. It's something to be moved away from, spurned and shunned, because survival and the drug culture matter more. Okay, the impact of wider politics is something that's considered much more in Once Upon a Time. It's wider in its scope. Gosh, Lam's story and Tony's story are told, but they're given much more context. The police, the Deborah Wallace from the police force, Andrew Jakubowicz, the professor of sociology, really considered those two stories as part of a bigger picture of what was going on in Cabramatta more generally in the 80s and 90s. Whereas broader society and politics are a bit more tangential, a bit more to one side a little bit in Happiest Refugee. They're alluded to, they're, you know, how Australians might see us, how we see Australians. It's a tangent, it's not a main part of Happiest Refugee. I also see this as being, again in terms of differences, as being a bit of a Sydney story. And the differences that can happen in Sydney if things are going your way and Sydney becomes a place of opportunity, a place of doors that slowly open, a place where hard work is rewarded. That's Arne Doe's story. That's the Sydney that Arne has. Arne has his knockbacks, his setbacks as he's making his way. The challenge with the sneakers, the Reebok pumps, and if he does well enough in basketball, he'll get a pair of Reebok pumps. But lucky he didn't, because he sees the violence on the train of someone who's beaten up for a nice pair of sneakers on the train in Sydney. But by and large, the Sydney that develops for Arne during the book is one of opportunities that get rewarded, of doors that get opened. Arne gets into St Aloysius. Arne, to be sure, he has to work there, but he does get in. And it's a similar story with law at Sydney University. He has to work, but he does get in. The opportunity opens up. And similarly, I would see the relationship that eventually develops with Susie as the third part of that success in Sydney story. Persistence in love is eventually met with a happy reward. And aren't we happy for Arne? Whereas the Sydney that takes place, the Sydney that is on offer, the Sydney that opens up for Tony and Lam is a very different Sydney. It's a Sydney of, what are these slanty-eyed people doing buzzing around? That definitely upsets my cat. It's a Sydney of, you don't belong here, go back to Cabramatta. It's a Sydney of teachers and a school system that only does so much and then stops. It's a Sydney of tough police. It's a Sydney of, what am I doing here? I'm Vietnamese, who am I? I don't really belong. It's a Sydney of drugs to ease the pain. Okay, looking at the differences in struggle between Happiest Refugee and Once Upon a Time in Cabramatta, I think there's an element of being in the right place at the right time for Arne, which does not happen for Son and for Tony. Son and Tony are always in the wrong place at the wrong time. In a sense, if you really want to boil it down to luck, Arne enjoys good luck, Lam and Tony encounter bad luck. Point number 2, explain the similarities between the struggles and successes experienced in the two. I would go back to that point I made about the two different Sydneys. Arne Doe experiences a Sydney of opportunity and of institutional doors that eventually open up, a pathway that eventually happens. Whereas Lam and Tony experience a Sydney of tough schools, tough streets, tough coppers, tough politicians. The third point, in your opinion, what was the hardest situation faced by the characters in Happiest Refugee and Once Upon a Time? In my opinion, the toughest time for Arne, the toughest times revolve around his father. His father is traumatised, his father turns to alcohol to cope with what he went through during the war, and this leads to family violence, family breakdown, and an estrangement with his father. Similarly, a tough time in summoning up the energy to reconcile with his father. Arne doesn't reconcile with his father straight away. He puts it off, he puts it off, he puts it off. He dials the wrong number and rings up Stavros the Greek somewhere in Sydney, and then that little misfortune, he steps back and puts it off. He reconciles with his father successfully and happily, but it does take time. Whereas, in my opinion, the toughest time in Once Upon a Time, for me, is when but dealing drugs leads to taking drugs. It's too much of a temptation. That in turn leads to police, that in turn led to prisons and traumatic detox experiences. Right at the end, in the credits that scroll past, we find out that Tony became a preacher and that Lam Nguyen now works in a printing business with his father Son and is clean and happy, but we only find those out as little bits at the end. Overall, I think both Once Upon a Time in Cabramatta and The Happiest Refugee serve to open up the eyes of a non-Vietnamese Australian audience to the joys and the pitfalls, the luck, the misfortune, the good times and the bad times, the spectrum of Vietnamese migrant experiences. And I do hope along the way that it's opened up your eyes to a broader Vietnamese experience in this context. There you go. My cat's pretty happy now.